Stop Killing Games has rightfully gained some momentum, but is it relevant for gachas? People often lament the way the modern world leaves us with less and less ownership of the things we buy. In some cases, this has reached absurd levels. Cars where you need to pay a subscription in order to enable the heating, which is already built into the seats. Printers which refuse to print if you buy ink from a different company. Or that one time Amazon deleted 1984 from Kindle devices. The Stop Killing Games movement aims to reverse this trend when it comes to games. In a landscape where almost everything is live service with endless microtransactions, and players seem to have no rights left at all, their initiative requests new laws which put back some ownership into our hands. Let's talk about what they're asking for, why you should pay attention, and why something which might sound like it's aimed at removing DRM from single-player games does apply to live service gacha games. First, for anyone who missed it, what is Stop Killing Games and why should we care? It's a movement which aims to challenge the legality of publishers destroying video games they have sold to consumers. Back in the olden times, buying games was very clear-cut. You bought a physical copy and then you owned that copy. You could play it however much you wanted for the rest of your life or sell it on once you were done. Expectations changed over time, and now we live in a world where we buy a license to play instead, where games are often designed to break entirely as soon as the publisher decides to turn off their servers, including games which should work as a single-player experience. Even if you do buy a physical copy, you often can't play until you've also downloaded some updates from their servers, or perhaps just connect to some DRM handshake to confirm you own the copy, so even that doesn't avoid the problem. There are some niche places whose entire selling point is that you actually get to own the games you buy, GOG being the most popular example, but it's depressingly rare. But in our perpetually online world, it isn't quite that simple. How could ownership possibly work for live service games? What about multiplayer ones? How should it work for free-to-play games with microtransactions? This is a complex issue, touching on consumer rights, game preservation, the logistics of digital ownership, intellectual property, the industry's sustainability, and even the intersection between art and commerce. Regardless of your perspective on the questions this movement seeks to ask, if you ever spend any money on games, you really should care. The reason it's important to highlight this right now is that the movement has a petition active in the EU and time is running out for people to sign it. The petition asks the EU to require publishers who sell or license games to leave them in a functional state once they decide to stop supporting them. That's obviously a very simple summary of this complex issue. We'll explore some of the nuances shortly through the lens of gacha games. For the initiative to be valid, it requires at least 1 million signatures from EU residents before its deadline runs out. The deadline is at the end of July, so there's a little under a month left. A week ago, it was at 450,000 signatures. As I'm writing this, it has just passed 750,000. It looks like it might actually happen. In large part, that sudden burst of momentum began when the movement's leader, Ross Scott, posted a video talking about the end of the movement, which included a breakdown of how one content creator called Pirate Software single-handedly killed all of its momentum last year by willfully misinterpreting everything about it and pushing a false narrative to his much larger audience. Ross had tried to avoid spotlighting drama, but this petition is the last chance to actually make a difference. Once it's finished, there isn't really anything else left worth trying. With the deadline looming, he felt that the initiative was failing anyway, so addressing the misinformation directly was the last thing he had left to try. Thankfully, it seems to have worked. If you're curious about how all that panned out, there are a lot of videos covering it in detail, and I highly recommend searching them out to find out more. It's also important to highlight what this petition does not do. Some people seem to be under the impression that if this petition passes, the entire games industry would instantly be required to go back and update all the games to comply with this new law. That's not even remotely correct. This petition asks the EU to start consulting about how the potential legislation could work. That consultation would of course involve affected consumers, but the people working in the games industry would rightfully have an important voice in any discussions and explorations every step along the way, and their input in making sure the law is actually viable would be vital. And any laws would likely include exceptions for existing games. When we create laws which do things like improve building safety, we don't go ripping down entire cities if each building is unable to live up to the new legislation. This would be no different. It's absolutely true that this could be inordinately expensive for developers to retrofit existing games for a world they were not designed for, but that is not a reason to just throw in the towel before even exploring the options. Once the requirements are in place, future games would be built with them in mind and the costs would be dramatically lower. Of course, it's also important to acknowledge that even if this all goes to plan, the laws would only exist in the EU. While the EU is flawed in many ways and is just as trapped in neoliberal paralysis as the rest of the West, it seems like the world is locked into an enthusiastic race to find out which of the dystopias from the most iconic science fictions of the past century can outcompete the others in a world where all of them exist at once. In the face of all that, time and time again, the EU has proven effective at forcing meaningful change. It's a large and desirable market which companies feel they have to pay attention to, and since it would be a lot more expensive to create a separate version of a product for just one region, generally EU legislation has global effects, and it often changes things for the better despite much corporate grumbling. That does pose interesting questions about how sovereignty actually works in our interconnected world, but frankly, it should go both ways. Corporations take advantage of this every day, for example by shifting their taxes to the cheapest locations to maximize their profits. So if we consumers can get some small benefits, I'm all for it. Either way, this is an actual chance for people to band together and make their voices matter. It should be obvious why this proposal makes sense for single-player games, but it's reasonable to question how it would work for anything live service, especially when there's a multiplayer component to the game. The initiative is not intended to require developers of live service or multiplayer games to provide support indefinitely. It's also not intended to force them to release their intellectual property. The question of ownership feels even more nebulous when a game is free to play and funded by some form of microtransactions. The initiative argues that even when players did not pay up front for a copy of the game, if the game includes microtransactions, there should be some form of accountability. The developers should not be able to just take everything away with no recourse. It highlights the grey areas of digital goods and asks for clarification. Companies couch their terms in legal language, which asserts that when you buy some in-game currency, you don't even own the currency per se, and the company retains all rights to it. Anything you unlock by using the currency is even further down that rabbit hole, and you really don't own a thing. But all of that is written into contracts, not law, and this is our opportunity to draw a line and say that we should at least consider the possibility that maybe things should work a little differently. Most of the time, the companies have all the power in any transaction, so they've been able to set the terms and slowly push towards making things more and more predatory over time. They have to create some shareholder value, after all. I personally feel that if you spend money on digital goods, it should imply something more than the company now owns your money. It feels reasonable to require that the developers have some form of plan set out in advance for how they'll handle closing their side of the relationship, which should ideally leave the things you bought intact. Other reasonable people may find valid reasons to disagree. Finding a workable middle ground is the point of the process. In the past, multiplayer games were able to function without centralized servers, and gamers were able to privately host the games themselves. There's nothing preventing devs from building games with that in mind in the future, and laws designed for this could be the push developers need to do so. However, the initiative does acknowledge that while we can hope for games to be built with this in mind in the future, for current games, often the best we can ask for is for a responsible and respectful shutdown. The FAQ section of the initiative's website mentions a few online-only games which they felt shut down in a responsible way, and some of them basically did everything we could ask for. Take Knockout City, for example, an online multiplayer-only indie dodgeball game which was shut down in 2023 after 2 years of service. When the developers decided to close out the game, they announced their plans months in advance and explained what the steps would be and how it would affect the players. They disabled monetization during the game's final season and adjusted all the rewards so that all the fans who took part would gain a ton of currency for free instead, in the hopes of turning the game's last few months into a celebration of everything that had come before it, and capped it all off with a final tournament at the end. And after they closed the official service and ended development, they released a version of the game which supported private servers, enabling indefinite single-player LAN party or full online play whenever there's an audience for it. The devs retained all their intellectual property rights, the consumers retained access to the game they enjoyed and the items they purchased, and the game is preserved for future people to try out if they choose to. Everybody wins. Of course, not every game out today could do this, especially if they rely on a complex web of third-party services to underpin what they provide through their own servers, but it is possible and it wouldn't bankrupt the industry. Gachas are an even more interesting case study because they're often a little bit of everything. The ones I play are free to play with expensive microtransactions, have a heavy focus on single player content, but have a co-op functionality built in, and a large part of their appeal is being part of an ongoing cycle of fresh new content and the vibrant community which that creates. Even if you only ever play the single-player story and ignore the co-op, ignore the events, even ignore the gacha system itself, every single interaction with the game is dependent on a connection to the company's servers. The actual content of the game could easily be a standalone experience, but the companies want to retain far more control. And while the amounts people spend on these games are astronomical, it's pretty normal for them to reach a point where the developers no longer feel it's worth continuing and announce that it's time to shut the servers down. When they do, everything poured into every one of those accounts is gone forever. The communities which spring up around these games also get dismantled too, leaving players with a sense of loss beyond just the game itself. Some games do provide some form of a memorial, often just a way to view the history of your account or perhaps a retelling of the story in a different form, and some do indeed let players host their own private servers for the game. But for many, the core appeal of gachas is the endless cycle which always brings something new places to explore, new characters to meet, new challenges to overcome. While many of those aspects would naturally disappear once the game reaches end of service, the fact is that these games actually would work quite well as standalone experience, and the companies absolutely make enough money to afford implementing the required changes. Many of the things which make gachas successful actually heighten how important all of this feels to people. The stories are designed to hook you in and build up parasocial relationships between the player and the characters involved. All of the best narrative video games do this to some degree, but gacha monetization is tied to making the players care about the characters in a way which just does not apply to the same level in other niches. The prospect of losing access to your accounts can therefore feel just a little more personal when it's a gacha. And in addition, for many players, the amount of money they spend on gachas would far exceed what people tend to spend on other games. And to be clear, for most people, gachas turn out to be cheaper on average than they'd pay for similar amounts of entertainment elsewhere. The difference is the scope and sticking power of the gacha model, which means all those smaller purchases build up over the course of years. Even someone spending just a $5 a month would spend hundreds by the time their game reaches the end of its life, so the value they might place on their account could far exceed what they'd likely feel towards a more traditional single-player game. And all that investment of time, all those emotions, and the shared experiences with the community over the course of years all combine to provide a powerful sense of nostalgia when someone looks back at their experience with these games. But that does beg the question, if so much of the appeal of gachas is that shared journey, all the time-limited events and one-time content, the experience of finding out what happens next as part of a huge community all following the same narrative and so on, even if you could keep playing after the story is over, would you? One interesting aspect of this whole discussion is the question of modifications to the original content after the original publisher has stepped aside. Many would probably want to retain creative control even after they let it go, but depending on how the intellectual property rights function in a world where there's an actual process here, there's potential for player-driven change, which sounds very interesting to me when it comes to these games. A very basic setup would enable players to edit everything in their accounts, unlocking every duplicate of every character, every weapon, and so on, much like the unauthorized private servers which some hackers have created for some of these games already. I'd imagine that could be fun for the novelty value, but would feel empty pretty quickly. What I personally would be more interested in for games like Genshin or Wuwa would be more extensive changes. For one thing, someone could go through and edit out all the fluff dialogue so that the soul of the story could shine through without the painful storytelling. It might be worth replaying just for that improved experience. Even more interesting would be some changes to the gameplay. Imagine if you could dial up the strength of enemies in the overworld so that all fights were truly challenging and the world felt like a hostile place. Or imagine if you could play an actual Nuzlocke account where the moment a character died in combat, they were wiped from your account. This kind of thing has long been a thing elsewhere. Just look up the Pokemon ROM hacking community, where dedicated fans create entire new games with new characters and stories built as modifications on top of the early games if you want to see how far people can take it. It is very much a legal grey area, especially when it comes to intellectual property rights, but it seems possible that the proposal might lead to even more along those lines. It can be so much fun to revisit beloved games, even if the live element is gone, but adding in so much potential for player customization and creativity could see these games live on much longer than you might think. Of course, it's also vital to understand the developer's perspective and the constraints and trade-offs which exist when considering the kinds of structural change which the proposed requirements would enforce. Perpetual support of unprofitable games is unsustainable. We cannot expect publishers to burn money running servers, creating updates, fixing bugs, running customer support, all at a loss indefinitely. Releasing source code or server files could open up potential privacy issues or even legal liabilities, especially if the services involved rely on third-party code or assets which the developer doesn't own outright. There will be many more issues with this proposal which need to be taken into account, and if this petition is a success, it's important that the developers' voices are heard and these aspects are resolved in a way which satisfies all parties. There is also the concern of market saturation. The more games which people can play, the harder it is to stand out, and if all past games are to remain playable, the bar will forever be inching upwards. But frankly, that's the way it should be. People will still want new things, so there will always be space for new ideas. While most developers understand the emotional attachments players develop for their games and the value of preservation, their main motivations are business sustainability, technical feasibility, and protecting their own rights. The challenge ahead is to find a balanced solution that addresses the concerns of consumers without imposing an unbearable burden on the creators. And if you think the requests here are too nebulous or would completely kill the industry, just remember, people said the exact same things about GDPR destroying the internet itself before the EU implemented that legislation. The internet is still here. Games will be fine either way. I think it's absolutely worth the effort. I've often had the thought that someday in the future I will log into each of my favorite games for the last time. For the live service ones, the timing might be out of my control, and it's a bittersweet thought that something I love might be taken from me before I'm ready to let go. There's no excuse for single-player games to be bricked because the publisher turned off a server which the game doesn't even need to run. I'm also on the side which feels that people who purchased any other game should retain some rights to access the thing they bought in the future, even if it does require a little bit of effort to make it work. Even if it turns out this will not always be possible, it's a conversation that deserves to be had. If you're in the EU, please look into this some more and consider signing the petition. I would if I could. Until next time.